There's a very specific kind of relief that washes over someone when a narcissist, after weeks or months of coldness, criticism, or chaos, suddenly becomes warm again, attentive, generous, affectionate in ways that feel almost like the earliest, most hopeful days of the relationship. And I want to address this moment directly today because it's one of the most dangerous moments in the entire cycle, precisely because it doesn't feel dangerous at all. It feels like relief. It feels like proof that things can still get better, that the difficult period was temporary, that the person you fell for in the beginning is still in there somewhere, finally resurfacing. I want to walk you through why this sudden kindness happens, what it's actually accomplishing psychologically, and why falling for it, however understandable, tends to cost far more than the temporary relief it provides. Let's start with something important to understand before anything else. Sudden kindness from a narcissist, especially kindness that arrives without any real explanation or accountability for whatever preceded it, is rarely a sign of genuine internal change. This can be a difficult thing to accept, especially in the moment it's happening, because the kindness itself often feels completely real. They seem genuinely warm. They seem genuinely present. They may even reference the difficult period directly, acknowledging that things have been hard, that they know they haven't been at their best, that they want to do better. All of this can feel like exactly the acknowledgement you've been waiting for, and this is precisely why it's so effective, and precisely why understanding what's actually happening underneath it matters so much before you decide how to respond. The first thing to understand is what psychologists sometimes call the reset function of intermittent kindness within a longer pattern of instability. Relationships with narcissists rarely operate as a single, sustained state. They tend to cycle, moving between periods of tension, criticism, or withdrawal, and periods of warmth, generosity, and closeness. This cycling isn't random, and it isn't simply the natural ebb and flow that exists in any relationship. It serves a specific psychological function for the narcissist, whether or not they're consciously aware of engineering it. The difficult period accomplishes something important from their perspective. It reasserts control, tests how much you'll tolerate, and often extracts concessions or accommodations you wouldn't have offered during a calmer period. But difficult periods that extend too long risk something the narcissist's psychology can't tolerate. You actually leaving, actually disengaging permanently, actually building enough distance that reconnection becomes impossible. The sudden kindness that follows serves as a reset, pulling you back into closeness right at the point where your own patience might otherwise have run out, restoring just enough goodwill to keep the relationship's overall cycle intact. The second thing worth understanding is the specific timing of when this sudden kindness tends to appear, because the timing itself is often more revealing than the kindness's content. Pay close attention to what typically precedes this warm period. Has something changed in their own life that makes your continued presence newly valuable? A setback that requires comfort, an achievement that requires an audience, a new relationship or opportunity that's fallen through, leaving a gap that your renewed closeness would conveniently fill. Or, alternatively, has your own behavior recently signaled something concerning to them, increased distance, a conversation about leaving, a boundary that threatened their usual access to you? In both cases, the timing reveals that the kindness is responsive to something happening in their world or in your relationship dynamic, rather than emerging from a genuine, independent process of internal reflection and growth that would exist regardless of external circumstances. The third thing to understand is why this sudden warmth so often lacks a specific quality that genuine change actually requires: direct, unprompted acknowledgement of specific harmful behavior, paired with a clear description of what will be different going forward. Real accountability sounds remarkably specific. It names the actual behavior, takes ownership without immediately pivoting to context or justification, and describes concrete change rather than vague, general warmth. What you'll notice if you listen carefully during these sudden kind periods, is that the warmth itself often substitutes for this specificity rather than accompanying it. Affection, gifts, attention, and charm arrive in abundance, while the actual behavior that caused the difficult period goes largely unaddressed, mentioned only in the vaguest possible terms, if at all. This substitution isn't accidental. Warmth is significantly easier to perform than genuine accountability, and it produces a similar emotional effect in you. Relief, hope, a softening of your guard, without requiring the narcissist to actually confront or change anything about their underlying behavior. The fourth thing worth understanding is what this sudden kindness actually accomplishes for the narcissist beyond simply restoring closeness, because there's often a more specific, more calculated function happening underneath the surface. Sudden kindness frequently serves to reset your own internal ledger, the one we discussed in earlier conversations, the accumulated record of grievances and unmet needs you've been quietly tracking throughout the difficult period. A sufficiently warm, generous gesture, an elaborate apology, a thoughtful gift, an unusually attentive week can make that ledger suddenly feel less significant, less urgent, easier to set aside in favor of enjoying the current pleasant moment. This is precisely why so many people find themselves during these warm periods genuinely struggling to access the clarity and grievances that felt so undeniable just days or weeks earlier. The warmth doesn't just feel good. It actively works to dissolve the very evidence you'd been building toward the eventual boundary or departure the difficult period was pushing you toward. The fifth thing to understand is the specific role this cycle plays in preventing you from ever reaching a stable, sustained clarity about the relationship as a whole. If a relationship remained consistently difficult, consistently cold, consistently unsatisfying, you would likely, over time, develop a clear, confident understanding of the pattern and act accordingly. The alternating cycle of difficulty and sudden warmth prevents this stable clarity from ever fully forming, because just as your confidence about leaving builds toward a decisive threshold, the sudden kindness arrives, softening that confidence, reintroducing doubt, making you wonder whether you were being too harsh in your assessment, too quick to give up on someone who clearly, given this current display of warmth, is still capable of the connection you originally hoped for. This isn't a coincidental side effect, it's precisely how intermittent reinforcement functions, and understanding this function is essential to recognizing why this specific pattern feels so much more difficult to leave than a relationship that was simply consistently bad throughout. The sixth thing worth understanding is the physiological experience these warm periods create, because it's genuinely powerful, genuinely difficult to override with logic alone, precisely because it operates on a level beneath conscious decision-making. After a period of tension or coldness, your nervous system has likely been in a heightened state of stress, vigilance, or sadness. When sudden warmth arrives, offering relief from that state, your body experiences something close to genuine physiological reward, a flood of relief that feels, neurologically, remarkably similar to genuine happiness, regardless of whether the underlying relationship dynamics have actually improved in any meaningful way. This is exactly why sudden kindness can feel so convincing, even when your rational mind understands the pattern intellectually. Your body is responding to the relief of tension, not necessarily to genuine, reliable safety, and conflating these two experiences is one of the most common, most human mistakes people make when trying to evaluate whether a relationship's sudden improvement is actually trustworthy. The seventh thing to understand, and this one deserves particular attention because it explains why some people become increasingly confused rather than increasingly clear as these cycles repeat over time, is what happens to your own sense of reality when kindness and difficulty keep alternating without ever resolving into a consistent, predictable pattern. Each time sudden kindness follows difficulty, it reinforces a specific, damaging belief that your perception during the difficult period must have been somewhat exaggerated. Because look, things really can be wonderful. This person really is capable of exactly the warmth and connection you'd been missing. This belief accumulates over repeated cycles, slowly eroding your confidence in your own read of the relationship's actual, sustained reality, until you find yourself, even after years of this pattern, still genuinely uncertain about what the relationship actually is, still unable to hold a stable, confident assessment for more than a few weeks before the next cycle arrives to complicate it all over again. I want to pause here and say something important about why recognizing this pattern matters so much, beyond simply protecting yourself from the immediate relief these warm periods provide. Every time you accept sudden kindness at face value, without requiring the specific accountability genuine change actually requires, you're not just risking disappointment when the pattern inevitably cycles back toward difficulty. You're also teaching your own nervous system, reinforcing your own trained response, that warmth alone is sufficient evidence of safety, that you don't need to require anything more specific, more sustained, more genuinely demonstrated before lowering your guard again. This training doesn't just affect this specific relationship. It shapes how you evaluate safety and trustworthiness in every relationship that follows, which is precisely why breaking this specific pattern matters so much more than simply surviving this particular cycle successfully. This training doesn't just affect this specific relationship, it shapes how you evaluate safety and trustworthiness in every relationship that follows, which is precisely why breaking this specific pattern matters so much more than simply surviving this particular cycle successfully. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because recognizing the pattern is only useful if it also equips you with something practical, a clear way to actually respond the next time sudden kindness arrives, one that protects you without requiring you to become cynical or permanently guarded against genuine warmth wherever it might actually exist. The first thing worth establishing before we get into specific responses is a distinction that matters enormously in this exact moment: the difference between accepting kindness and trusting it completely without question as evidence of lasting change. You don't have to reject the kindness outright, treating every warm gesture with hostile suspicion in order to protect yourself from the pattern we've been discussing. You can accept a kind moment for what it is, in the present, while simultaneously withholding the deeper trust and full re-engagement that would require actual, sustained evidence of change. This distinction matters because trying to reject kindness entirely, treating warmth itself as inherently dangerous, tends to be exhausting and ultimately unsustainable, while learning to hold kindness at arm's length, appreciating it without fully surrendering your guard to it, is a far more sustainable, realistic practice you can actually maintain over time. The second thing worth practicing is developing a specific internal test you apply whenever sudden kindness arrives after a difficult period, a test that cuts through the emotional relief and asks the more important underlying question. The test is simple to state, though it requires real discipline to actually apply in the moment. Has this kindness been accompanied by specific acknowledgement of the actual behavior that caused harm? And has enough time passed with consistent, demonstrated behavior to suggest this isn't simply the reset function of a familiar cycle? If the answer to either part of this test is no, the kindness you're experiencing, however genuinely pleasant in the moment, doesn't yet constitute evidence you can safely build renewed trust on top of. This doesn't mean you have to reject the moment or make a scene about your skepticism. It simply means internally, privately, you continue withholding the full re-engagement that genuine change would eventually earn, while outwardly remaining calm and measured rather than either fully embracing the warmth or aggressively rejecting it. The third thing worth understanding is how to communicate this measured response without escalating into a conflict that undermines your own clarity, because the goal here isn't confrontation, it's simply protecting your own internal position while the situation continues to unfold. If asked directly why you seem less immediately warm in return, something as simple as, I'm glad things feel easier right now, and I want to see this continue for a while before I fully relax again. Communicates your position honestly without requiring an argument, without accusing them of insincerity, without demanding immediate accountability. They're unlikely to offer convincingly on command anyway. This kind of measured, honest response protects your position while leaving the door open for genuine change to actually demonstrate itself over time, rather than requiring you to either fully accept or fully reject the kindness in the exact moment it arrives. The fourth thing worth practicing, and this one requires real discipline, is resisting the urge to bring up the entire accumulated ledger of grievances during this warm period, even though the temptation to finally, while things feel calm and connected, air everything that's been building can feel almost irresistible. I want to be honest about why this temptation exists and why acting on it usually backfires. Warm periods feel like safe openings for difficult conversations precisely because the emotional atmosphere feels conducive to being heard. But narcissists, during these warm periods specifically, are often at their most skilled at appearing to receive difficult feedback graciously while doing very little internal processing of it, precisely because the warm period itself is functioning as a performance of receptiveness rather than genuine sustained willingness to change. Save the substantive conversations, the boundary setting, the naming of patterns for calmer, more neutral moments, rather than trying to have them specifically during the warm period when the emotional dynamics make genuine, lasting impact significantly less likely. The fifth thing worth understanding is how to build deliberately, over time, your own internal record of these cycles, so that pattern recognition eventually replaces the emotional whiplash that currently accompanies each individual cycle as it happens. This might look like keeping a private note, even just for yourself, tracking roughly how long warm periods tend to last, what specifically preceded them, whether any actual behavioral change accompanied the warmth, or whether it was purely emotional and gestural. Over several cycles, this record becomes genuinely powerful because it transforms your understanding from a vague, emotional sense that this keeps happening into concrete, specific evidence you can return to whenever the next warm period arrives, and your emotional relief starts pulling you back toward forgetting everything you've learned so far. I want to talk now about something that deserves real, honest attention. The specific grief that comes with learning to hold sudden kindness at this kind of measured distance. Because this grief is genuinely real and deserves acknowledgement, rather than being glossed over in service of a tidier, more triumphant narrative. Part of what makes this pattern so painful to recognize and resist is that the warmth in the moment often genuinely does feel like exactly what you originally wanted from the relationship. Learning to hold back from fully receiving it, even when you understand intellectually why holding back protects you, means grieving, again and again, the fact that you can't simply trust and enjoy something that feels, in the moment, like exactly what you'd been hoping for. This grief doesn't mean your caution is wrong. It means you're a person capable of genuine hope, genuine desire for connection, sitting inside a situation that has repeatedly taught you that hope, in this specific context, isn't yet safe to fully act on. The sixth thing worth understanding, and this is perhaps the most important reframe of everything we've discussed today, is what actually distinguishes a genuinely repaired relationship from one still operating inside this cycle. Because I don't want this conversation to leave you believing that all kindness following difficulty is inherently suspicious in every relationship for the rest of your life. Genuine repair looks different from the reset function we've been discussing in several concrete ways. It includes specific, detailed accountability rather than vague warmth alone. It sustains itself consistently over an extended period rather than dissolving back into difficulty once your guard has fully lowered again. And critically, it doesn't require you to forget or set aside legitimate grievances in order to enjoy the current, improved dynamic. If warmth arrives alongside genuine, specific accountability, and that combination sustains itself reliably over months rather than days or weeks. That pattern deserves a different kind of trust than the cycle we've spent this conversation examining. The skill isn't permanent suspicion of all kindness everywhere. It's learning to distinguish between kindness that functions as a reset and kindness that functions as genuine, sustained repair. And that distinction becomes much easier to make once you understand exactly what to look for. I want to say something directly now to anyone listening who's currently experiencing exactly this moment. The sudden, unexpected warmth after a difficult stretch, the relief flooding through you, the part of you that desperately wants to simply relax into this feeling without questioning it further. I understand that wanting completely. The relief you're feeling is real. And the part of you hoping this time might genuinely be different isn't foolish or naive. It's simply human, shaped by a very reasonable, very understandable hope that people you love are capable of the growth you keep hoping to witness. But I want you to hold that hope alongside the clarity we've built throughout this entire conversation, rather than letting the hope completely override everything you've learned. You can hope for genuine change, while still requiring the actual evidence that would make trusting that change safe. Those two things aren't contradictory. They're simply two parts of the same wise, self-protective clarity that this specific moment requires from you. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations. Not a dramatic rejection of kindness, not a cold, suspicious refusal to enjoy a genuinely pleasant moment, but something quieter, something that actually reflects the measured wisdom this entire pattern requires. Picture yourself receiving that sudden warmth, that unexpected kindness, that flood of relief after a difficult stretch, and allowing yourself to feel the relief fully, honestly, without pretending it doesn't affect you. And then picture yourself quietly, internally, holding a small, protected space of continued clarity alongside that relief. Not fighting the warmth, not rejecting it outright, but simply refusing to let it completely erase everything you've learned about how this specific pattern tends to unfold. Picture yourself waiting patiently, watching for the specific evidence that would distinguish genuine repair from another turn of the same familiar cycle, giving yourself permission to enjoy the present moment without fully surrendering the hard-won clarity that protects your future. Because that is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. Sudden kindness after difficulty was never actually the finish line you'd been hoping for. It was simply one more moment in an ongoing pattern, one that requires your continued discernment rather than your complete relief. And learning to hold both the warmth and the wisdom simultaneously, enjoying what's genuinely pleasant about the present moment while refusing to let it erase what you've learned about the larger pattern, isn't cynicism. It's exactly the kind of hard-won clarity that eventually, whether within this specific relationship or beyond it, protects you from having to learn this same lesson, painfully, all over again.